This is the first prototype of my first ever commercial video game. And this is version 1.0 of that first ever commercial video game. And not to brag, but it might have exploding rockets. In this video, we're going to see how I gradually moved from that early prototype to version 1.0, and I'm going to talk about all of the challenges, mistakes, and everything else that happened during it. Are you ready? Let's do this. As you've seen, my first version wasn't very good. In fact, all you could do was move left and right. There weren't any animations or anything, the rocket was just a square, and really the only kind of cool thing is the rocket particles, and even those aren't very good. All in all, not a very good game. But fast forward 93 days later and look what we have now. This is version 0.1.0, and included in it is many rockets that you can choose from. Now let's see what it looks like when you actually play it. As you can tell, this version was good. But just 3 days later, here's version 0.1.2. And this version fixed basically every single bug that I was complaining about just before. You can move left and right, and unfortunately you can take damage, and because I chose the slowest rocket, I was taking quite a lot of damage. But this rocket was also able to go turbo and destroy everything in its path without taking any damage, and perfectly sync up to the music as well. So that was pretty good. We also have this orange rocket, who has really cool engines, and can detach its boosters, and those will destroy every asteroid in their path, but eventually they'll break, unfortunately. The main thing I added in this update was rocket abilities. Depending on the rocket, you can use them like 1 or 2 times, and they would do special things, mostly relating to blowing up asteroids on the screen, without you having to take damage. However, right now, I won't talk about the rocket abilities much, because I overhauled them in an update called the Ability Update. Alright, on to the next version. This version was 0.2.0. This was the first version I released publicly. It didn't really add anything as far as I know. It was just the version that I decided to release, and it got released. So that was the first time Direct Ascent got seen by the public, even though it got seen by like 2 people or something. But, you know, it was a start, and although no one really ever saw it, and no one's bought it yet, which makes me think that I probably shouldn't be calling it my first commercial video game. But if you want to let me call it that, there's a link in the description for you to buy it. You might as well, it's only $5, and I think the game's pretty fun. But apart from that, the game went on hiatus for a couple months until I came back about 2 months later and started working on version 0.3.0. This version was called the Variety Update, and in it, I made one of the best changes I ever made to Direct Ascent, and that was adding multiple areas. This was the Variety Update. Before this update, the game was just endless asteroids. All the same, nothing really changing except the speed of the asteroids. This made the game not very replayable, or really even playable for very long. You would just play the game, you'd have a fun experience for a little while, but eventually you'd get bored, and there wasn't really anything you'd want to do with it anymore. However, with the Variety Update, every 2 minutes you would change areas. You would start off with things like space junk and satellites falling, but after a little while, you would move to the asteroid area, where you were in the asteroid belt, and there were a bunch of differently sized asteroids that were falling and trying to blow you up. After that, in the Variety Update, there would be a comet area with some cool comets that you would have to move around, and due to some factors like falling speed and horizontal speed, they will be a lot harder to traverse than the previous 2 areas. All 3 areas would have different obstacles, different music, and just an overall different mood. It would make the game much more interesting to play for longer periods of time, and hopefully that would just make the game more overall fun. And that's exactly what happened. The game became way more fun to play, and it opened way more doors to add content to Direct Ascent. However, in this update, I also made a big mistake that stayed in the game for far too long. and that was the length of how long you should stay in each level. You see, for 0.3.0, the length that you'd stay in each level was 3 minutes. A fair bit later, I changed it to 2 minutes, and while I was trying to record footage for the later areas for 0.3.0, I realized just how long 3 minutes was, and I wasn't able to get to the third area before rage quitting. So, unfortunately, right now, there's not going to be any footage of that third area. But hopefully, later, there will be. But anyway, that was a big mistake that I made. I made the levels go on for far too long, and they got kind of boring, and the game was also kind of clunky anyway, so it was way too hard to get through the levels. But now, let's take a look at version 0.4.0. This version was the Interstellar update.
Direct Ascent's Interstellar update was a pretty minor update, so I won't talk too much about it. However, I want to talk about a few things that I did in this version to make the game way better. The first thing that I added was an animation that played whenever you started a new game. Previously, the first thing you would see when you started a new game was just a rocket flying through space, straight up. Now, you would start by seeing the rocket on the ground, starting its engines, and then finally ascending upwards, and then transitioning to the rocket being in the area where all the obstacles are falling on it and you have to avoid them. This made the game better because not only did it feel realistic, the animation was really cool and I was really proud of it, and it kind of brought the game together. Another addition that made the game better was the addition of a new area, Interstellar Incident. Now, instead of 3, there were 4 areas that you would be able to go through, and they would all have different variety, different moods, and they all looked pretty cool. At the moment when the update was released, I didn't have the music for Interstellar Incident yet, but eventually, once it was done, it was one of the best sounding things in the Direct Ascent soundtrack. In fact, the entire Direct Ascent soundtrack's extremely good, and in fact it's so good that I use it as some music in my videos. However, I must say that the music wasn't made by me. They were made by someone else who made them for me specifically for this game, and I have to give him lots of credit for Direct Ascent, because otherwise the game would kind of be boring and it wouldn't have the same mood that I had wanted it to have. But I'm kind of off topic right now, so let's get back to what I was originally talking about. The final things that I added in 0.4.0 were your ability to activate your ability with the spacebar, and some fixes for some bugs that were kind of breaking the game, such as one that made you not be able to die at all. Yeah, that's kind of a problem, you have to admit. But bug fixes aside, 0.4.0 was a pretty small update, but it did a lot of things that made the game way better. So let's move on to version 0.5.0. And in this version, I overhauled the rocket abilities, because before this, I hadn't really paid much attention to the abilities of the rockets. You never wanted to use them, because they were single-use only, most of them, and the other ones you could only use twice. And since Direct Ascent was supposed to be a game that could go on endlessly, your only being able to use it twice kind of made it not worth it to use it ever. There was also the problem of most rockets having the same exact ability. The ability for nearly all of the rockets was just to detach its boosters, and those boosters would destroy the obstacles in their path. And although it was a cool ability, almost every single rocket used it as its ability, so it was kind of boring, and it definitely needed some overhaul. So that's exactly what I gave it.
This was version 0.5.0, and that was the ability update. But first, I want to talk about the other features that I had in the ability update. First, the Saturn V was revamped. It now could move a bit faster, it looked a bit better, and finally, it had some new engine exhaust that looked a bit cooler. The End 1's engine exhaust was changed a bit to look a bit cooler, and also to look less static. The movement system was revamped to take inertia into effect. The landing engine was upgraded to improve performance and to make it look slightly better. The UI in the title screen had some polish applied. And finally, for the last two things, your hearts were more animated and were more polished, and some code was upgraded to be a bit better, more efficient, and undeprecated. But now I want to talk about what this update was really all about, and that was revamping the abilities. As I said before, all of the abilities were limited in uses, and since the game was supposed to be endless, that just wasn't very fun and you didn't want to use your abilities ever. Now, however, I introduced new abilities and they would regenerate infinitely, just with a bit of a cooldown. There were also new abilities for most of the rockets that previously just had boosters that could detach. The space shuttle could release a satellite from its cargo bay that would collect money for you, which was pretty cool. The Delta IV could light itself on fire for a little while to become invincible before fire extinguishers on the rocket would extinguish it. Those were the two new abilities that I added, and the things that I just talked about made the game way more fun to play. So yeah, that was the ability update. Pretty cool, I must admit. And on to version 0.6.0. the second to last update. And this update changed Direct Ascent majorly. This update was the progression update. This update changed the game in many ways, and I think I'll explain it best by just reading a bit from the changelog. Experience new encounters when playing as you progressively unlock rockets by completing certain achievements. Start with the space shuttle and its puny ability to release a satellite that tries its hardest to automatically collect money for you, but isn't very good at it. Advance to the Falcon Heavy, whose boosters can proficiently eradicate the obstacles in your path. Unlock the space launch system subsequently, and so forth. So that was a direct quote from the changelog, and I think it sums it up pretty well. When you started a new save file, the only rocket you could play with was the space shuttle. But once you did things like reach a certain score or reach a certain area, you would unlock new rockets all the way up to the Saturn V. This was the best decision I made ever since I added progression inside the levels for 0.3.0. This made the game even more worthwhile to play for longer periods of time. You felt like you were getting somewhere, and it just made it more fun. Another major thing I changed in this update was making it so that you could only fly a rocket once every 2 deaths. This meant you couldn't fly the same rockets over and over and over. It forced you to use the other rockets and see what kinds of abilities they had and what other stats they had that were different than the rocket you're used to playing with. This, along with all the other things I had added, just made the game way more fun to play, more replayable, and just overall made the game better. And now, time to talk about the last version of Direct Ascent, version 1.0. And this version changed Direct Ascent majorly again. Instead of completely endless, the game would have a boss fight at the end, which you would have to complete, and then you would go back to the title screen. I did plan in later versions of Direct Ascent to make it so that you went on after the boss fight to an endless section, but I'll admit, I was about ready to be done with Direct Ascent, and I wanted to work on other things that I had. Maybe sometime soon, I'll release version 1.1 for Direct Ascent, but for now, it just ends with the boss fight. However, I think the boss fight is pretty cool. It's a dragon capsule that's shooting things like neutron stars and everything at you, and you have to dodge them. Oh yeah, I did also add a new area with neutron stars, black holes, and stars that are just falling from you, and they're pretty hard to avoid. Most of them also did double damage, so it was even harder to get through the level, but it's kind of made up for by how good the level looks. But let's talk about the boss fight, since I think I did pretty well with it. First, there's a cutscene where the dragon capsule, infested with robots, does some cool things, and it doesn't really make sense, but it starts off the boss fight pretty well. Somewhere in the cutscene, your rocket gains a magnet on it, and that magnet comes in extremely handy. I can't explain this boss fight in words very well, so I think it would be best if I just showed you some footage of me fighting the boss. There's not much else for me to say right now, so just enjoy. As you can tell from why I blow the dragon capsule up, even version 1.0 of this game wasn't very finished. This was another big mistake that I made with this game. I released the full version of the game and stopped development on it, even though there were plenty of things that weren't finished yet. This was probably my biggest mistake when I was making Direct Ascent. I also promised updates after version 1.0, I just didn't make them. In fact, this has often been my problem with game development. For some reason, I just always have trouble with keeping my promises for what I'm going to make. I've been trying hard to keep them, but still, it's pretty hard. But, maybe I might do Direct Ascent version 1.1. I'll add some really cool things in there that I promised during the development process, but I didn't add. But yeah, that's about it for the development of Direct Ascent. Thanks for watching, hopefully you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!